Thank you for that intro. So I am talking about 4 different groups. Oh, dear, wrong side. Sorry. And I'm looking at, we're already familiar with TaskRabbit, Uber, and Airbnb, but I suspect most of you don't know about Kitchensurfing. Kitchensurfing is only in the US, and I'll talk more about it, but it's essentially rent a chef. And I look at these 4 groups in terms of both their barriers to entry, so anyone can become a TaskRabbit, you just have to have time available. As opposed to Uber, you have to have a certain type of car within the last 5 years under certain mileage. Airbnb, you must actually have space. And I'm doing my research in New York City, so space is at a premium. As opposed to Kitchensurfing. And this is right in the middle, and that's because there are actually 2 different versions of Kitchensurfing. So to start out, I'd actually like to introduce you to 2 of the people that I have interviewed in my research. The first of these is Jamal. Jamal is a Stanford-educated sociology major. He's working, yes, I'm a little concerned about that part. He was working as a TaskRabbit. He wanted to move to New York. He was looking for jobs. He couldn't find anything. He was homeless except for living in a hostel which caught fire. And he's talking in this quote about one of the projects he was hired to do on TaskRabbit. A individual who had a little fish pond had him come over, clean the fish pond. He wasn't given any type of protective gear. All of the photos in this presentation are stock photos except for 2. And one of those is that photo down there at the bottom. Those are actually Jamal's feet. He sent me this photo after he had cleaned the pond. And he says how he still has nightmares about doing this particular task. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we have Joshua. And Joshua is a corporate attorney. He makes over $200,000 a year in his full-time job. And he is a self-described Airbnb syndicate owner. He has 10 different apartments that he has split between multiple listings on Airbnb. And he actually he jokes about using mafia terminology to describe his work, where, you know, they're sneaking around and they're making cash payments to building superintendents. And this is the other actual photo. And these are lock boxes. And this is so that he doesn't actually have to interact with any of the clients. They go to a lockbox that's attached to a planter. These are all over New York City. They go in, you enter the code, you do the combination, and you get the key out to go and access the Airbnb that you have rented. So in this presentation, I'm looking at the issue of whether people in the sharing economy are part of the precariat or if they are micro-entrepreneurs. And precariat is a concept that comes from Guy Standing, and he describes this as individuals who not only have insecure jobs or move uneasily between short-term jobs and spells of unemployment, but who lack any sense of occupational identity or narrative to their lives. Their incomes are insecure, and their housing is often insecure. By comparison, the dictionary definition of an entrepreneur is simply somebody who organizes or operates a business. And a micro-entrepreneur simply has a business of 5 people or fewer. Now, Standing talks about the 4 components of the precariat. He says that there are 4 characteristics that help to define them. The first of these is anxiety, and this is a major component for individuals who are part of the precariat. Their work doesn't give them identity or meaning or happiness. They don't know where their next paycheck is coming from. They don't know when their next paycheck is going to be coming from. Then there's anomie, despair that escape to a better life is not actually possible. These individuals are increasingly excluded from the mainstream. They can't necessarily plan ahead, buy houses, prepare for their retirements, or even start planning vacations. There's also alienation, where they're often forced to do things for money that they don't necessarily want to, like having to clean out somebody's fish pond in their bare feet. And they're both overemployed and underemployed. They're overemployed in the sense that they're working too many hours for low pay. And they're underemployed in the sense that the jobs that they're taking are below their education levels. They've put in too much time in their education for the job they're actually doing. And the fourth A of the precariat is anger, which I think makes a lot of sense given the first three. So a little bit about the methodology of my research. I have interviewed 30 people so far. This is very much in process. I'm aiming for theoretical saturation of probably between 80 and 100 people. It is mixed methods research conducted between March and May of this year. My most recent interview was actually a week ago, so I am very much in the middle of things. The average interview length has been about 2 hours, but they have ranged from an hour to over 3 hours. And I'm using an interview matrix, so I'm allowing my respondents to very much guide the interview, to tell me their stories of working in the sharing economy, and then as needed, I'll sort of push them back into my questions. There's also a demographic survey looking at race and sex, looking at also the reasons that they were attracted to the sharing economy. And I've been transcribing and coding my interviews based on grounded theory, which is an inductive measure, an inductive approach that allows concepts and theories to come out of the data itself. So who are these 30 people? Well, I have 12 women and 18 men. They are overwhelmingly very well educated. 43% of them have bachelor's degrees. 20% have a graduate degree. That's an MD, a PhD, or a JD, or an MA. The majority of people I've interviewed so far have been with Airbnb, which is particularly interesting because of how Airbnb is set up in New York. I've had a very difficult time getting Uber people to talk to me. So I've actually spoken to 4 additional ones who were not able to fill out the survey. And then the majority of my participants have been in the age range of 20 to 39. And of course, they've almost all been white, with about 20% being African American or black, and 6.7 identifying as Hispanic. So in terms of anxiety, the issue of reviews often comes up as something that makes workers in this field incredibly anxious. There's an often mentioned discussion that getting this review, that if the review is not positive, that people could end up getting kicked off the platform, that nobody else will hire them in the future. A lot of people talk about in the beginning, when they don't have reviews, having to put their rates really low as a way to sort of urge people to hire them. Well, it's only $10, I'll hire that TaskRabbit. Or, oh, I'll rent this apartment, it's only $100 as opposed to a much higher price. And this woman in particular, Samantha, who's an Airbnb host, and these are all fake names, she isn't actually present when she rents out her space. She has we would normally call it a living room. It is the living room, there's a curtain, and her bed's on the other side, and that's what she rents out. And then she has a roommate who's in the actual bedroom of this one-bedroom apartment. And so she's not there to interact with people, and it makes her worried that she might get a bad review because she can't sort of spin things in a favorable measure. She can't bring them wine or leave them chocolates if there's a problem, which is a common strategy among hosts. Now, Airbnb is particularly interesting here in New York because it's actually illegal in many cases, which is also why I'm surprised that people have been willing to speak to me. As of 2010, they made a law in New York that you cannot rent out your apartment for less than 30 days unless you are there. So you cannot rent out a whole apartment. If you have a spare bedroom and you are present and the person you're renting to has access to the whole space, that is legal, but not a sort of empty apartment rental. And so that's an additional source of anxiety, especially for Airbnb hosts, that they might come home not just to discover that their guest has destroyed their apartment or has stolen their products, but that their landlord might be evicting them. In fact, there's actually a task force in New York that also looks into adult establishments. So Airbnb and apparently pornography and strippers get grouped together in New York. And this task force will actually follow up with neighbor complaints and then bust people, and they can be fined and lose their apartments. There's also an issue of not being able to plan ahead. So we have Sarah here, who's a TaskRabbit, and she's exhibiting an AMI. She's talking about how she has no idea where her money is going to be coming from. Now, Sarah was actually working for TaskRabbit before they did the platform change. So she experienced the bidding process, and then she experienced the flat rates. And she was on the first vacation of her adult life when TaskRabbit announced the platform change. And she said she had no idea if she could spend any money on vacation because she didn't know if she was going to come back and not have any work. And then even for hosts where it's going well. So Brittany here is 24. She actually has 2 apartments on Airbnb. She has her apartment where she lives, which is down in Brooklyn. And then she has a studio that she has rented specifically as an Airbnb product, so that she lists the studio and it's available all the time. And this has meant that she doesn't actually have to work a job. So she's able to make enough money from renting out her studio apartment, a couple $1,000s a month, that she doesn't work. And she feels like it's maybe like the money is too easy. There's not enough of a challenge there. And then we also have the issue of alienation. And Michael here is 41, and he has a PhD. He actually worked as a professor at Dartmouth. And he moved to New York to be with an internet girlfriend. He wasn't living with her quite yet. And he ended up putting himself on TaskRabbit. And he has done 50 tasks in just a couple of months. I met him on his 2nd or 3rd task, and I interviewed him later on. And he talks about how now he's delivering donuts. This is very much a job that you do not need to have a doctorate to do. And then we also have additional alienation where sometimes TaskRabbits and Uber drivers are actually being hired to do things that appear to be fairly illegal. So this is Jamal, our Stanford-educated sociologist, and he was hired to pick up somebody's prescription from a local drugstore. Now, this is a perfectly normal task. It's an errand-running task. But after he picked up the prescription, the woman got in touch with him and said, "She's in China. Please mail me the prescriptions." And he looks into this, and he goes, "I don't think I'm allowed to mail prescription drugs across the borders." And he calls TaskRabbit, and he actually plays this recording for me. And TaskRabbit says, "You have to do what they've paid you to do. The person hiring you is always right." Now, he's like, "I'm not going to do this." Especially in New York, we have a history of stop and frisk, where young black men in particular are often stopped. They're searched for drugs. We also search people before they get on the subways sometimes. And so for a week, he carries around these drugs in his backpack, hoping he doesn't actually get stopped by anybody. I've also met an Uber driver who found himself on a 2-hour drug run, where he was hired to drive people around. He couldn't get them out of his car. Meanwhile, they're jumping out, they're doing drug handoffs, and what is he going to do? It's not surprising that we experience a lot of anger from these individuals. So Sarah and Jamal in particular talk about how, anytime somebody talks about community, they assume that that's just code for "I'm going to exploit you." And Jamal uses the term modern-day slavery to talk about his work with TaskRabbit. He, fortunately, he's still tasking a little bit on the side, but he does have a full-time job now. So his story does end well. And in fact, I even asked people if they consider themselves to be entrepreneurs, and most people say they don't among all of these services. So whether they're an Airbnb host, in particular, they often say they're not. Now, there is one exception to this. This is also an individual who doesn't consider himself to be an entrepreneur. And in fact, he works for Facebook and rents out his apartment so he can go on vacation. And even he doesn't view himself as an entrepreneur, somebody who works for a startup. Now, there is one exception to this, and that is Kitchensurfing. And there are 2 versions of Kitchensurfing. There's traditional kitchen surfing, where you can go online and you can hire a chef. The chefs pay a 10% fee. There's a listing of them, and you negotiate what you want them to come and make for you. And then there's Kitchen Surfing Today. And this is a Monday through Friday option for $25 per person. A chef will come to your house with all the ingredients, all the items to make the food for you, and they will cook you dinner. And that $25 is everything. Tip, tax, the ingredients, their labor. They even clean up and serve you. I know, it's quite a deal. I wish you lived in New York. And these chefs are actually paid for each shift. They are paid $15 an hour, which is a really good wage in New York for cooking work. They're also given a free weekly metro card, which is another $32 or so. And these chefs actually do view themselves as entrepreneurs. Out of the 8 that I've interviewed so far, 6 of them have actually said that they consider themselves to be entrepreneurs. In fact, they are using the service as a way to get business. A lot of them have side companies where they are doing a cheese tasting company, and they're cooking for people. They're personal chefs and private chefs. One individual who has a master's in teaching actually wants to become somebody's personal chef where he will also tutor their child, which I'm surprised he's still on the market, because in New York that would be very appealing to a lot of people. And so I would argue that the issue of whether or not workers in the sharing economy are members of the precariat or if they're entrepreneurs is something that has a lot of nuance. Kitchen surfing chefs, at least of the ones that I have interviewed so far, seem to want, in many cases, they talk about wanting to start a company or even having a company right now. They have a lot more prestige, and they have a lot more skills compared to somebody who's in Uber or TaskRabbit or Airbnb. And they're more likely to view themselves as entrepreneurs, as opposed to everyone else that I've interviewed who simply talks about getting into it for the money. And I'd argue part of the issue here is that, you know, in an age of the Food Network and artisanal everything, being a chef is something that people dream about doing. And kitchen surfing gives them that option. But nobody dreams, or at least very few people dream, about growing up to become a taxi driver or a personal assistant or an innkeeper. So I'm very open to questions.
Questions? Thank you very much. Very interesting. I was just wondering, are you aware of anyone else doing research like this in the world?
Do you want me to answer that now, or should I wait? Well, I know that Dr. Shore here has a huge team and a MacArthur grant. I'm super envious. And I know that you're doing some work with actually interviewing individuals, but I haven't come across anybody else who is actually interviewing workers. There are some journalistic accounts where a journalist is going to do TaskRabbit for 30 days, but those are individuals who don't try to pay their rent and make a life out of it.
Great. So just maybe coming back to your question, and then I have one for you. So Mary Gray at Microsoft Research at New England, she's been doing a lot of work looking into crowd workers. So, but I think the book is still in process, so that'll be coming out soon. We've also done a bunch of work on Airbnb hosts, interviewing them, and I was curious to hear, did you see at all a mix of social motivations coming into play as well, where there would be any kind of interpersonal gratification? Because we saw a lot of that in our studies. Well, the money was important, but it wasn't the whole story. But New York City might be quite different from San Francisco, Helsinki.
Right. There were a couple of people I interviewed who said, yeah, I want to do it for community. And then as the interview went on, because these were quite lengthy, it came out that this woman owed $150,000 for a recent operation. And even though she had said that she was doing it to meet people, it became apparent that it was often for the money. That, in fact, on her survey, when I asked what the money went to, it went to her basic necessities and paying off her debt. For some individuals who've even gotten into it just for the money, they've been surprised at how much they enjoy meeting people. So yeah, there's definitely a community aspect to it. It often seems to depend on whether they share the space with somebody else. So a lot of people talk about never meeting the person. They're just ships passing in the night. They hand off the keys. The keys are left at, if they don't have a key box, the keys are often left at a local bar or even at a laundromat. So it very much depends. But yeah, there is an aspect of wanting to meet people and community.
Just a practical question. In terms of the kitchen surfing, you said it was $25 an hour. Who sets those rates? Because in London we have something similar called Grub Club, but each chef kind of sets their own prices. And I was just wondering about.
So Kitchensurfing sets these prices. In fact, for the Kitchensurfing today, the Monday through Friday, you have no idea who you're getting. They work directly for Kitchensurfing. There are 3 menus for each day. You pick what you want, and then at 4 o'clock, they send you an email saying, Chef Bala is going to show up and cook for you today. In terms of setting their rates for the Kitchensurfing, where you actually just hire the chef directly, Kitchensurfing tells them, we're going to have a menu that's $50, we're going to have a menu that's $100, or something that's $40. And so the chefs have to create a menu that will fit into that and keep in mind their fee to Kitchensurfing and then their transportation and the ingredients. No. Even the Kitchensurfing Today ones who are paid by Kitchensurfing directly, they are 1099 workers. But at least they do have money coming in. So even if Kitchensurfing only has 1 gig for them to do that day, 1 person to cook for, they'll still get paid for the full 5 hours. Yeah. So they have a higher level of dependability on their income.
Thanks. Yeah, very interesting, and I'd love to talk to you further about the food aspect, something that I'm working on as well. So, but just following on a very practical question, in terms of health and safety regulations and insurance, I mean, that in the food sharing sphere, that aspect is important, not only the precarious nature or the flexibility of the work, but also those. So how is that dealt with through the Kitchensurfing?
What a really good question. It's not. I interviewed an individual who twisted his ankle, or he was putting on his boots and he sort of fell sideways and he threw out his back to the point that they're saying he probably needs surgery. And he called up Kitchensurfing and told them, and they were like, all right, well, your job's going to be here for you when you come back. So they have no protections. Kitchensurfing recently has started implementing a little bit of training so that they can make sure that people are cooking their chicken the same way. And so that's sort of an optional thing each day when they come in where, like, oh, you can make the food with us. And that's open to usually like 10 people out of 40 or 50. But that's it. They're not protected by anything else. So if they get hurt on the job, they're out of luck.
Or burn the kitchen down or something.
Yeah, or if they burn your kitchen down.
Yeah, thank you very much for a set of very, very interesting stories. Coming from having really enjoyed listening to these stories and seeing all the depth and also really diversity among the different situations that people are in and how they experience working through these platforms. I was wondering if you could tell us more about why you are asking whether they are micro-entrepreneurs or precariat and what your reason for doing that is in relation to this hugely diverse set of experiences.
Right. Yeah, that's a very good question. I view myself as a super adjunct. I teach at a bunch of different schools, and so I have hired people through TaskRabbit in order to help me with some of the administrative stuff. Not the teaching, but like the data entry. Those of you who teach, there are all these like administrative requirements. And I met a TaskRabbit. I met Jamal, and when I started talking to him and he started telling me about what his life was like, I realized that this is something that so many people don't know. You hear so much about, oh, we're building community and we're making the world a better place. And when I start to meet these people and I talk to them and I find out what their lives are like, I feel like there's a lot of, share washing going on. And so that was why I wanted to know. I wanted to know if he was simply a sort of outlier or if there were more people like that. And I'm interested, I think, in the sort of the situation of workers at large. I mean, when you adjunct, when you're a contract lecturer teaching in a lot of different schools, you discover very quickly that there's a level of inequality in academia. And if you start seeing that in other places too, it makes me wonder about sort of like the changing nature of work, if it's going to affect everyone there.
Can I have a last question? Also following up this morning's keynote. Now, there may be already signs, or at least theoretical expectation, that these people will organize themselves and form a countervailing power, for example, versus Airbnb. Did you already, in your interviews, talk about that, and can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes. So actually, in the course of my research, I met somebody who was working directly for Airbnb. I call him my informant. And he was on the campaign to organize individuals. And so I asked all of the Airbnb people about this organizing. The organizing is to change the laws. It's funny, everyone that I talk to talks about, there's some antique law about how you can't set up, a hotel in your apartment. It's from 2010. Like, it's kind of a new concept here, guys. But everyone says, no, I'm not, it's amazing. They have a really negative view of Airbnb in many cases. They're very critical of the campaign that we saw earlier about, Airbnb is letting New Yorkers stay in their homes. So even though they realize it is, and in many cases it's helping them to stay in their homes, they're still like, this is not sharing. This is not a good thing. I would say they're not ready to organize yet for Airbnb, and they're not able to organize in the other areas because they haven't met people, but there's a rising sense of sort of discontent that this is not what I signed up for, this is not what I went to college and graduate school for. There is Peers, which is an organization out of California that's supposed to help to connect members of the sharing economy, but it was actually started through Airbnb, and they've come under some controversy because they're made with sort of the company insiders. They're funded by Uber. So I don't know. I kind of hope there'll be some type of union organizing, but I don't see it happening yet. And I think possibly because there's a lot of villainizing of unions in the United States, where people view it as, you just pay money for dues and you don't get anything.
Four presenters. These were really fantastic papers. I thought it was a great session. And I guess we have time for a break now, but thank you all, and look forward to talking more about